on my attention. My countrymen, they love their fiction. The words are now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to 10200, the Politics and Media podcast. We're here for a midweek episode with Kieran Kelly and Dr. Josephine Buggies. How you doing, Kieran?
I'm doing absolutely fine. I've been spending the day with skinks, and who could ask for a better way to spend a day?
And how are you, Josephine?
Oh, I'm all right. Still following all the news coming out of, the Strait of Hormuz, the big quagmire that the United States is in at the moment. Yeah, but also looking at all the drama coming out of the United States to divert our attention away from its failures. So, yeah, I'm all right.
Well, look, we're going to be talking a bit about that today for our audience. We're in constantly unprecedented times, right? And you alluded to the illegal U.S. and Israel war on Iran there, and the recent alleged attempt on Donald Trump yesterday, the day before. And the way the news has been treating some of this stuff is, we talk about kayfabe a lot, we talk about the theater of it. And as a media podcast as well, we like to try and follow how that stuff is being communicated and how it gets reported and what's top of the docket. Now, as far as Western media goes, we see a lot regarding the way that the US is stamping its dominance on the world, a lot about how evil their enemies are. And we also slowly see this kind of degradation of what I guess we broadly call US democracy or US attempts to be the authority, to be the sole great power in the world. But maybe that's not all there is to it. Maybe there's some other things going on here. And I wanted to pass to you, Kieran, to kind of give us a quick summary of what we're talking about today, and what we're going to try and have a discussion about, because I think it's something that kind of lurks in the back of a lot of our minds, but we are so often just trying to react to the day-to-day current events. Also, this is mostly a current events podcast, right? That we don't get the chance to take a step back and say, all right, but what's really happening here? So over to you, Kieran.
Yeah, well, like they say, every accusation, every Zionist accusation is a confession. It's true of the US empire as well. And they like to call other governments regimes, but there is no regime more regime-y than an imperial regime. They're not really they don't have a government controlling things as such, because, and this isn't new. If you look at the Spanish Empire, it impoverished the Spanish people and destroyed their economy. The British Empire ended up in the late 19th century, early 20th century. They had among the most impoverished people in Europe, with high malnutrition and so forth. Once you have an imperial polity, you end up with an elite that runs things for the sake of the empire, using the tools of empire. They no longer work for or with the people of the country. So even an autocrat who is in a bounded country with no imperial possessions is more responsive to the local people, because there's the chance that they'll storm the palace and chop their head off. Whereas that doesn't happen in empires so much, So I think one of the things that we need to start with is understanding that the constant framing of things as being to do with US politics, and US politics being some sort of democratic process, like, oh no, gasoline prices, oh, Donald Trump will pay pay at the polls for this. And it's like, well, that doesn't matter to the empire. The empire doesn't give a fuck who is in the Oval Office, really. I mean, it does to a certain extent, but they pick and choose, and they make sure it's the right person. And he happens to be really fucking good for them at the moment. And, again, that may be a sign that things are a bit desperate for the empire, because they are kind of burning all the bridges. They're kind of ripping off the mask. They're losing their soft power and so forth. But I think we also have to recognize as well that their hard power is at is at an all-time high, and what is happening in Iran actually doesn't hurt them unless their allies actually start to do something about it, because it's hurting their allies. And, so, I mean, I think what their attack on Iran is a move of desperation, maybe, or a risky move, but at the moment, they're not really paying consequences. They are an oil producing country. They effectively control Canada's oil and Venezuela's oil as well. That this is harming their, let's say, enemy in China, but also their power rivals in Europe. So more than it's harming them, it's harming their people, but they don't care about that. So, yeah, um, they are doing all sorts. They are governing in a way that does not help their people in any sense. They seem to be dead set on going down a path of making life into something out of like Andor or something like that. Nasty, brutish, and short life for the work units that are formerly called people, and more and more concentrated power in the hands of a system that destroys all human and natural value in order to extract as much as it can. So yeah, that's the way I wanted to frame it, and then kind of see where we can find the balance between what seems to be something that's kind of cracking at the edges, but at the same time has established itself more deeply internationally in terms of the reach of the imperial institutions, such as the financial dominance, the economic dominance, the military interoperability, the spread of their military industrial complex into other countries, and their like the spread of their judicial sort of system, their kind of sense of universal jurisdiction through those sorts of things like the financial reach as well. And obviously having the FBI office in this country is a prime example of that. So yeah, that's what I was thinking. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kieran. It was Vladimir Lenin's birthday on the 22nd of April. And I just want to connect what Kieran said to Lenin's writings in The State and the Revolution from 1917. He said, what capitalist democracy represents. I mean, although it talks about freedom a lot, it is simply democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich, and that is the democracy of the capitalist society. Marx and Engels talked about, similarly, democracy in liberal capitalist states as a glorified committee. So the executive of the modern state, according to Marx and Engels, is a glorified committee to manage the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. So this, what we're seeing right now in the United States is exactly what Lenin said, is exactly what Marx and Engels said, is that what their government is doing is not in the interest of the people in the United States. It's in the interests of, a very small minority of people who control the economic levers as well as the political levers in that country. The foreign policy of the United States is, in the interests of this oligarchic class. And, there used to be a time when the United States was an industrial powerhouse. And ever since, especially the globalization of neoliberal capitalism, all the Western countries have declined as industrial hubs, and they've the moment that the capitalists got an opportunity to take their capital where to places where they could deregulate labor and exploit labor, which is what the United States and the West did through the financial institution called the IMF after the decline of the Soviet Union. You can see this happening across the world, including in India, where I am from. In 1991, we had IMF reforms, and the IMF reforms, IMF gives out loans, and in exchange, it demands policy. It directs policy to countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, but also Eastern Europe and across the world, right? So, financial institutions like the IMF have been tools of imperialism where um, finance is given out under the condition that our markets are liberalized, our labor markets are deregulated, and so forth. So the foreign policy of the West, thereby determines domestic policies in many parts of the world, deregulates labor rights, causes or forces labor rights declines, not only in the global south, but we're seeing that here as well, right? In the current government, for example, removing fair pay agreements. All this is part of that same tendency, which I link to this term called the global imperial system. So, for the last many decades, global south anti-imperialists have looked at imperialism not as simply a tendency or an ism, rather through a lens of, a global system, right? So you could think of it as a world system, or like Claudio Katz, who is an Argentinian Marxist economist, says global imperial system, right? And so this system, we can identify it. It's not just like, an abstract concept. You can identify imperialism, the imperial system, through its visible and tangible infrastructure across the world. For example, the military bases all around the world. We know that the United States alone has over 750 military bases across the world, now including their allies' military bases, which, for example, Britain has been allowing the United States to use its military bases, its intelligence and surveillance networks, both for the Gaza genocide and now for Israel and United States war on Iran. So the military networks are tangible infrastructure that we can see through which the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class, headquartered in the United States and in Western cosmopolitan centers or metropoles, impose their will not just in their own countries, but across Asia, Africa, Latin America. And so for this imperial network, the concept of sovereignty, what we call Tino Ranga Tiratanga here, is really something that is against their ability to extract resources and labor from across the world. So in its essence, imperialism stands against people's sovereign interests, sovereign movements, and this is why the struggle in Palestine is such a difficult struggle, because Palestine is in this really important geopolitical, geostrategic location adjacent to the Red Sea, and in that region, resource-rich region, the oil-rich region of the world. So for this imperial system, which seeks to dominate the whole world, that seeks to commodify the labor and the resources across the world, it's really inconvenient to have sovereign movements, whether it's in Palestine, whether it is a country like Iran, which is, standing on its own as an island of sovereignty in a region that has bent its knee to Zionism and the U.S. imperialism over the last few decades, right? So if you look at Iran, it's surrounded by U.S. military bases including in the quote unquote negotiator nation of Pakistan. Pakistan has operated as a U.S. military base for so long, including against their own people, right? So you got Pakistan, the entire Persian Gulf region, all having U.S. military bases on it, except Iran, which is why Iran has been a thorn in the backside of Israel's plan to establish hegemony in West Asia, and which is why Israel has pushed for a war against Iran. And in this context of decline in the imperial core, right? So in the imperial core, in New Zealand, in Australia, in Anglo America, in Canada, in United States, and in Western Europe, the economies are declining. People are increasingly impoverished. And, the economies are now being driven by this, fake what do you say? uh, GDP, which is based in, for example, the military industrial complex. The ruling class has nothing to sell us, so they need to, rev up this war economy, keep producing tensions across the world so that governments, for example, New Zealand government recently pledged $12 billion on defense spending to just keep this tension up and keep the possibilities and new wars coming up again and again, which keeps this military industry, which is propping up the Western, markets at the moment. So yeah, the global imperial system is very tangible through military. It's the military networks, but also the financial networks. But at the moment, it is facing huge challenges from China, but also from Iran, which I am going to declare that the United States has failed in Iran.
Well, yeah, I mean, what you were talking about, the increase in the military industrial complex. And like, if you go back to the reason why the US deindustrialized and started pouring its money into something like that in the first place, it is because having a strong industrial production in its own country empowered organized labor there. So they had to, that is part of the reason why they became so invested in the empire, is because they couldn't maintain that at home. And one of the things that is key to understanding the reasons for pouring money into weaponry is that it's destruction of wealth. It's a way of destroying wealth for yourself and for others. And it is a mechanism of control. And if imperialism at its basics, in its most basic sense, is social reproduction, and so they use things like their economic power to like hard power, like economic power or military power, to reproduce those things through things like the IMF conditionalities, the Washington Consensus, this ideology of neoliberalism, which is spread not only through forcing governments to act a certain way, but through enforcing through the academic world a certain concept of what economics should be, an orthodoxy that takes over. And again, it concentrates power. It keeps people precarious, preventing them from autonomously developing their own economic security. And so I think this is the basic part of the nature of imperialism. Any empire is kind of like that, but of course it's very key in this particular empire, and oil is central to that. And because it's a globalized world, it means that they are highly challenged by a country like China that will actually put its resources into developing its own economy for the benefit of its own people. So yeah, I think this is a big part of why we're seeing the actions we've seen recently.
I want to just quickly draw a line between what's happening in countries like ours here in New Zealand, and I say New Zealand and not Aotearoa with intent, and other countries that you might say are more on the periphery, or aren't specifically the United States or England, including like Australia, some of the countries through Europe and the global south, because I think this is something that we, and more broadly, we, commentators, people or academics, people analyzing and critiquing events that are happening in the world, often miss is that we're so entrenched in this Western hegemony ourselves that we fail to understand the different ways in which this imperialism is being reproduced and strengthened between our own circumstances and those in the global south. So we're often seeing, what's happening in Iran or what's happening in Palestine, or any other number of, ongoing genocides that are occurring over the last, 100 years, let's say, as being othered. as being something that the US is undertaking upon a group that is not us. And a lot of liberals, but also a lot of progressives and a lot of leftists are like, oh, that's so bad. That's not a good thing. We're going to try and fight against it. We're going to try and vote these governments out. And alongside that, we've seen this increasing gap, and you were both alluding to this, the gap between the people of a country and their leadership, who are ostensibly democratically elected to represent us, but in fact never really were. And that has become clearer and clearer, especially post 2023, where the consensus in general in Western countries is strongly against genocide, and yet we have actually seen probably an increase in support from the governments in the West towards US and Israel-led genocide, but also, in Sudan, in Lebanon, in Syria, etc., than you would expect if this was a truly representative democracy. Alongside that, over the last few years, you've also, and this relates to something that you were saying, Josephine, you've also seen these active campaigns against indigenous movements within countries that were colonized. And you're particularly seeing this in the Commonwealth, you're seeing this in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. I think closest to home here, not New Zealand, but it was Australia with the voice vote, which was just wildly manipulated. A huge amount of resources thrown against Indigenous voices and the establishment of Indigenous oversight within Parliament. Here in New Zealand, around the same time, you had this immensely well-resourced campaign against co-governance. And at the same time, you had this other campaign against gangs in rural cities, both with heavy focus on Maori, Maori organizing, against Tino Rangatiratanga, against Maori, both ability to organize and impact the decisions of local government, but also central government, but also this really strong securitized pushback against the conditions that had been created for Maori that led to the gangs being established here, and this criminalization of societal conditions that were created by colonization. And it was a dual attempt to just drive down the ability of Maori here to be directly involved in decision making that impacted the sovereignty of all of us. It's not just Maori. This has also been a way for them to build distance between national level government and business, and your average voter, Maori or otherwise. So this stuff, as Josephine was saying, it is a global system, and there's global coordination around the ways that these things show up in your local politics. But you're saying you're kind of alluding to, Kieran, but this is part of what we're discussing today as well, is whether or not this gap that we're seeing, these kind of failed military objectives, is a decline of imperialism, is a decline of the US empire. Josephine, you declared that the US has lost in its war on Iran. It certainly failed at some of its major military objectives. That's really clear. It's failed even more than it may have expected, or people would have expected, in that the face of West Asian geopolitics has completely changed following the attacks on US bases in the wider region by Iran, taking out some of that logistical capability, right? Showing that there is a risk to housing US imperial infrastructure within your own countries. These are clear ways in which imperialism is being challenged. However, closer to home, in our countries, in the Commonwealth and the wider Western world, we have seen increased securitization. We've seen businesses and politicians who are far more than willing to get on board with a new kind of homegrown US imperialism. People talk about blowback or the imperial boomerang, but it's more than that. It's not just that the stuff is now being used against us, it's that the system is being changed in a way that makes it easier for them to extract from the populace in the countries that we're in. Now, I guess the challenge I want to give to you, Kieran, is that I think we often get drawn into what is happening here. And we see, our politicians are rocketing away from us. We can't do anything. We can't vote them out. It feels like they're just have a wild austerity budget. Public services are out the window. Jobs are being cut. People are having to leave. As you say, the poverty of the populace is increasing. However, I don't necessarily think that I care about that. On a level, as regards the US empire, we kind of like we can stand up and fight when we want. Like at some point, Western populations are going to have to do something about it. But where the imperial decline is going to be happening is in the global south. That is where the industrialization still is, where that organized worker base is still able to fight back in a way that it just can't, and especially in a country like New Zealand. Like our unions are fucked. We could not do a general strike here. Even if, we started building missiles for the US to use in the Pacific, it would be very, very difficult for us to organize labor in a way that was useful in changing that. But in the global south, a lot of that still exists. There's a revolutionary culture that still exists that has basically been stamped out in the West. And I guess my question to you is, what do you see as the divide between those two polities? And is the fight against imperialism, is what's going to cause the imperialist decline better seen within the global south rather than here at home?
Right. Well, yeah, I guess I guess I want to at least in part play devil's advocate here because there's no denying there's a lot of flailing and a lot of what seems to be pretty unsatisfactory attempts to do things that are not happening. But if we look again, like the as with events in the past, such as the supposed defeat of the US by Vietnam, the price that the US paid for that was nothing. There was nothing. They said that they were going to pay reparations, and then thumbed their nose at Vietnam. Then said, "Oh, Then they started this discourse of missing persons and POWs, and used that to get sanctions put on Vietnam, and basically didn't take them off until Vietnam basically joined the Washington Consensus." And now they've got a military base at Cam Ranh Bay. So I think we have to be very cautious about when we look at what seems to be dysfunction in the US and project that too much on its imperial power. Um, the their soft power seems to be, on the one hand, well, it's definitely failing, but at the same time, the hidden sort of power that they seem to exercise over the world's elites, and it's not just the Western elites, their control over leaders throughout the globe seems to be absolutely rock solid. People will sell their own country down the river without a second's thought. And I don't want to pick on them alone, but obviously the example that comes to mind has got to be the Gulf Cooperation Council countries that are not really acting in the best interests of their own country in doing this stuff. So you've got to think what is going on behind the scenes. What are the what are the levers of power that are being exercised that we don't see in the kayfabe of public diplomacy, we have, I think we have fooled in very silly ways about the nature of this power as well. And it's silly, and it's also, I think that to a certain extent, incredibly chauvinistic and a touch racist to say something like, "Oh, look at Saudi Arabia, they're buying such and such of Trump. That means that they control him." Or Qatar gave him an airplane worth a lot and they must control him. And it's like, oh yeah, these devious people giving away all their money to this guy. And you think it's because they control him? I feel that there is this tendency about the US actions to always say that they're being manipulated by outside forces, that the cunning Orientals or the cunning Zionists or the cunning whatever are taking them for a ride because they're all basically just genial, you know, genial guys who just want to get along with everyone, and the reality is very different, of course. They're incredibly ruthless, and they're incredibly practiced at all of this stuff to the extent that, no one else in the world has ever had as much institutional development of these sorts of tools of empire. So again, I'd say that we see this, their soft power is breaking down because they're rubbing everyone's nose and how much they don't care about other places. But at the same time, if we look at the reaction to the Holocaust in Gaza, we see that they had control people right down, not just the very top level, but many echelons down in governmental, non-governmental, corporate circles. They have these people's hearts and minds, and completely captured. So yeah, and you're talking about the split between that and the treatment of the country as such and the people of the country as such. And I mean, it's all a war against all of us. We are what happens to people in Palestine, what happens to people in Iran is what they're doing to us. It's not separate. They are coming for us one way or the other. We've got this ridiculous thing with the shooting being turned into this call for this ballroom to be made. Now, the ballroom is a hardened military data center, that's been reported on. And why do they want one at the White House? Well, I mean, my only thing, why is it so desperately needed that they need a command and control center and a communication center and a data center all in one place? I mean, it does to me sort of suggest that they are expecting to deal with revolting peasants, and they are going to deal with them using robots as soon as they possibly can. And and that's not exactly out of the realms of near future possibility. And they seem to be gearing up towards that. They certainly don't treat their own population in the US at all well, and they're only going to treat them worse and worse as time goes on, I think.
Yeah, I just want to agree with that. Like, they do not treat the working class within the imperial core well at all, although there is still this kind of myth of Western exceptionalism. However horrible things are, however, you know, precarious I am, however in debt I may be, at least I'm not Africa. At least I'm not in India. At least, so there's this kind of sense of Western exceptionalism, which is a key function of, racism today. I would argue that racism in today's world has shifted away in many cases, within the establishment, for example. I mean, not in all cases, but the dominant stream of racism is no longer biological, it is cultural and it's institutional, right? So it's this idea that, the systems and the cultures in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific, they're so inferior to the West that at least we're not in. I remember a person, whom I follow on New Zealand left saying in January 2026, when those protests in Iran got hijacked by the the Mossad agents and the CIA agents, turning them violent, which led to the deaths of thousands of people there, including over 100 police personnel. Somebody was saying, "Oh, when I look at Iran, I'm so glad that I live in New Zealand," and it's just that kind of a sense that this country has. And any Western country is just superior by its system. That is that is the racism that exists in the 21st century. In fact, if you look at a country like Iran, which is what I've been trying to, this has been my intervention in this period, is I have this anti-imperial compass in my head, and when the protest turned violent, I could just sense that this is, this is part of the hybrid war that United States and Israel has been waging against Iran for the last 47 years. And so I was very cautious when people were saying, oh my goodness, this mullah regime, this ayatollah, this all elements of Islamophobia, elements of Orientalism, they exist in the Western left. And this a consensus is what drives imperialism. And this is why imperialism, emanating from the core, is so effective, is because it has bipartisan consensus through what Kieran also mentioned about the capture of the minds, right? Of the capture of the minds of the working class. And of course, the ruling elite within the imperial core all believe in this exceptionalist idea that invariably all these countries, India, the countries in Africa, Congo, all these countries are inferior system. They are more corrupt. Oh, they're just corrupt nations. This kind of sense, like, why? What happened there? They, we'll never hear those realities, those facts of what happened in Congo, for example, that led to its destabilization. We still don't hear that, for example, Germany did genocide in Africa, in Namibia. They committed genocide against Herero and Nama people, and that doesn't even come into German discourse. It's only the Nazi genocide that comes into their discourse. They should feel equally about their genocide against African people, but it doesn't. It's all part of that Western exceptionalist discourse, and that's part of it. And yeah, so I want to remind people of how old this empire has been. This is, remember, it is a capitalist empire, and it is driven by the interests of the elite in the imperial core. And I'll give you some examples. Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in the 1960s. He was the first president of independent Congo. He was a young leader who, at the handover of independence to Congo after a genocide by Belgium, he simply laid out some of the crimes of colonization. And at that moment, the officials from Belgium sitting at that meeting said, who allowed this guy to speak, number one, and we need to get rid of him. So Patrice Lumumba's assassination disrupted the independent process of Congo in becoming a real sovereign nation since then. So it destabilized it. Then we look at Thomas Sankara in the 80s, right? This is the same empire. The US and the French intelligence are involved in that assassination of Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. More recently, right, this continues to happen. Evo Morales, the first indigenous president of Bolivia, who wanted to nationalize the lithium mines in Bolivia, which is the poorest nation in ore. To use Michael Parenti's words, it's no country is poor. They're overexploited nation in in South America. He wanted to just nationalize the resources, and he was removed. And I remember Elon Musk saying, because lithium is so vital in AI, but also in batteries that are required in electric vehicles and so forth. So, until right now, just in January, we saw the kidnap and the complete impunity that the West and United States, enjoys in just kidnapping a sovereign leader of a country, and how that, completely derails the relations and the politics and the sovereignty in the whole region, right? So you mentioned, Kieran, how United States still enjoys a lot of power in the global South. Yes, especially after Maduro's kidnap, when you look at what happened in the Caribbean and in Latin America, a lot of countries folded. Countries that were supporting Cuba through nation-to-nation agreements. You can't trade with Cuba. You could only have nation-to-nation agreements, and even those getting derailed after the kidnapping of Maduro. So Jamaica and Mexico stopping any kind of oil shipments to Cuba. So they still hold a lot of power, but we do see that their power is in decline in many ways. We can come to that. But I also want to touch upon, what Kieran mentioned before about the project of the elite in the imperial core. And I want to quote David Harvey, who was one of the key theorists of neoliberalism. And he says, an interviewer is asking him, how would you describe neoliberalism? And he says, I've always treated neoliberalism as a political project carried out by the corporate capitalist class as they felt intensely threatened, both politically and economically, in the post-war period, coming into the 60s and 70s. They desperately wanted to launch a political project that would curb the power of labor in the imperial core, but also across the world. So when we see neoliberalism, it goes hand in hand with imperialism. We need to see them as going hand in hand and not separate, right? Number one, and it is the and it is the reassertion of the imperial class over the power of labor in the imperial core, but also asserting their dominance across the global south. In India, we call the neoliberal reforms, which were imposed by the IMF, as a form of recolonization. So neoliberalism is indeed one of the key instruments of the empire, both within the core and across the world. And we must remember that, the empire at its root, at its core, at its foundation is anti-worker, and it's anti-environment, it is anti-sovereignty, it is anti-people and the planet. So if we want to have a future for this planet, a future for our children, for a future for ourselves, we need to fight against this ruling class, which, like both of you have mentioned, they are using AI and robotics not only to commit genocide in Gaza. I want to take your memory back to the scenes of Yahya Sinwar fighting in his last moments against not human beings, against a drone with he was already injured, and he only had one hand, and he was fighting not a human being but a drone. And these drones are they're not limited, they're not going to keep them for Palestinians or Hamas or however you want to describe the resistance in the global south against the empire. They're not going to be only for them. They are for working class people in the West as well. They've started surveilling us. In the United Kingdom, Palantir is now managing a bunch of the big databases, including the UK NHS, National Health Service. And, Palantir came up with a big manifesto on what their politics is. And it's rooted in Western supremacy. It's rooted in imperialism, in maintaining the US empire. And they will say it's about preserving the West, but really it's about preserving the capitalist and the corporatist elite in the West, or in other words, like Mohammad Marandi would describe it, the Epstein class. It's the people of the world against the Epstein class. That is the fight against the empire.
Yeah, I think when they refer to Western liberal values or even Western Christian values, right? That's who they're talking about. They're not talking about like what you and I might think back at, oh yeah, that's what the Greeks did, right? Or whatever. That's democracy and a certain type of economics and a certain way of organizing society. It is when they are saying it, it's coded language in the same way that we talk about certain racist tropes being coded language or dog whistles. When they say we're protecting Western values, they're saying, yeah, we're protecting billionaire pedophiles. And you can track that back like over centuries. Like this is who they are. This is what they mean when they're speaking about it at that level. I want to think about this idea of decline of empire, and Because I agree with both of you, right? Like, even at times when it's felt like, or it's been pitched to us that they have lost, did they really? Or did they consolidate something in the background? And while while the genocide in Palestine is happening, while that's been accelerating, and now during this illegal war in Iran, you have a variety of Western leaders who will say, "Oh, this isn't good," while, for example, in Australia, changing their hate speech laws, making terms like from the river to the sea to be hate speech in Queensland, I think it was, where you can be arrested for just like having a sign with that written on it. In the UK, changed to protest laws. Attempts to do that here in New Zealand. In places like Canada, where some politicians have spoken out about it, but then they got military contractors who continue to sell goods to Israel. In the UK, similarly, right? And you have that happening alongside other politicians like your Keir Starmer or your David Lammy in the UK, who are just fervent supporters of Israel and of genocide. But even they are having to say, "Oh, but we believe in the right to self-defense." You know, they know they have to lie about it, but this is not in itself. None of these things are a sign of decline. We also, you know, if you're a constant or a regular listener of this podcast, you'll know that we often talk about things like the rules-based international order or like the International Criminal Court as not being things that really serve the majority of the people of this world. They are tools of control for maintaining imperial power. And I think it was just a couple of weeks ago that Mark Rutte, head of the EU now currently, was just saying he loved President Trump. And this is during a period in which one of the major impacts of the current war in Iran, but also of the what's happening in Ukraine, the direct economic and material impacts of that fall on European countries. You've got the Nord Stream pipeline being blown up, probably by the US. Like that is relatively clear at this point. That is a direct attack on US allies and the energy sovereignty of their allies. And you still have the head of the EU, other people who are involved in NATO, like your Kai Kallas. She's NATO, no, she's EU Defense Minister, still saying that, oh no, we've got to back US empire. Even while our own people, our own economies, the state of public services, the state of public infrastructure is massively degraded and accelerating as well over the last 3 to 4 years. These people still will go onto a morning interview show and say, "We believe in Donald Trump." They'll literally use those words, and it's absolutely bizarre to watch. Because even people like von der Leyen, right, who likes to do that kind of very white supremacist, highly nationalist rhetoric around Europe, return to the fields kind of imagery, which she used, and I think in one of her latest European Parliament advertisements in the last couple of years. She doesn't give a shit about that. She's using it to get elected by the people who are voting for her. And then turning around and supporting and agreeing to policies that end up in the destruction of the countries that these people come from, the people that they're meant to be representing. And I think you're right to consider this a risk, like in believing that what we see is a decline in empire rather than a consolidation behind a billionaire pedophile class to grab more resources, to decrease regulation, to particularly regulation of labor, to increase the ability for exploitation in countries where there had ostensibly been a lot of progress, to bring it back in line, to castigate and control labor to an extent that we haven't seen in the West for a long time. More similar to the way that labor is treated in the global South, in these so-called corrupt countries, as Josephine was saying previously. And you see that through things like the corruption index and etc., these kind of frameworks of the way that we speak about the differences between our own lives and the lives of people that are not in the West, right? But they want all of that gone. Josephine, you also mentioned stuff about what's been happening under this government term in New Zealand, just the removal of workers' rights, the immediate repeal of fair pay stuff, just law change after law change, let alone like the significant intentional cuts being made to public services and public infrastructure to make life worse for workers, so that they can be more easily controlled and securitized against and not able to organize against it. What I do think, though, is that given some of the missteps in the recent decisions to wage genocidal war in West Asia in particular, we are at an inflection point. So this is a point at which there could be a consolidation of imperial power behind these billionaires, moving in any number of different directions, under a kind of tech surveillance state, just under raw military might, etc. But there's also, I think, some cause for optimism in that more people are realizing this, and there is an opportunity to really drive a wedge in here.
Like, just picking up on the fact that there is, of course, a very simple connecting thread to all of these things, which is that they're all about any level of autonomy that individuals or groups of individuals have for the empire is to be crushed. So you mentioned things like co-governance and labor rights and so forth. We're having an attack at the moment on conservation land because, according to Shane Jones, we're riddled with it. And so, these sort of things, this is an enclosure movement on steroids. They are taking away all of the commons from the people, and we will be boxed in little cubicles. Again, you kind of have to see this as going very rapidly towards something out of science fiction, because everything that they can't charge us for, they don't want us to have. And we are not working for them if we are doing things for ourselves. So there is that. But I mean, in terms of the decline, there are problems with contradictions within the system. And I think that this is built on generations of clever liars who lied about their reasons for doing things in order to build a geostrategic supremacy for the US, ruthless, but knowing what they're doing. Whereas the current lot the power seems to have been inherited by people who really don't understand any of that. They are simply just kind of believers in their fascist narrative, and of course, you do have Alex Karp's, basically reiteration of a kind of fascist manifest destiny sort of idea of Western supremacy and the US as this exceptional nation, and Josephine mentioned earlier, like the idea of the West being the new racism. But I think it always was there. It was just that there was open racism at the same time, and the discourse of Western civilization was always racist. It's the biggest in-group in the world is Western liberalism, where if you believe in it, anything that it does wrong doesn't count because it's an exception, but everything right in the world comes from it, and you don't, and everyone who is opposed to it or outside of it, everything they do wrong is symptomatic of who they are, and it's this big self-reinforcing idea of exceptional virtue that Westerners have given to themselves that actually coincides with notions of whiteness, but they never even think about that. A lot of these people, they never even think about the fact that they're talking about a bunch of white people being superior to everyone else on the planet. So I do think that ultimately it is possible that they can build, like, they can kill off, 3/4 of the world's population and just have robots and slaves left with a bunch of fucking billionaires just living the high life or whatever. Maybe they can, but if assuming that they can't, then I don't think that they can run things in the future because they're fantasists. They wouldn't know the difference. They don't seem to know the difference between truth and lies, particularly. They think that their lies become the truth because they have power. So, that's part of a reason for hope, I suppose, is that they're absolute lunatics.
Yeah, there is this question of why is it that, the Western elite, the Western ruling class, but also like it's a global ruling class as well. There's billionaires in different parts of the world who benefit from the global imperial system. And why is it that they're holding on to this empire when, it's very clear for any level-headed analyst that things are going to the shit, right? Like um conflict is coming up, people, the possibility of guillotines coming back. It's not that far, it's not that far-fetched to think about that. But also, the future of the planet, right? Like we're seeing increased intensity in weather events and frequency in intense weather events happening. It's just looking really bleak in terms of, what the future holds for us. But they're still like holding on to the last vestiges of power, including like even in EU, for example, you were mentioning how they're still so wedded to this imperial system. You're seeing like countries like Finland and that, which were decided to be neutral after the Second World War, joining in with NATO, which is, which has been historically an offensive alliance, which has a horrific history inside Europe as well. So it really, why is it? And my theory is this: it's that what what the alternative is, right? What is alternatives to this current global imperial system, which is dominated by Western elite? The alternative is probably, what China represents. And if you think about it, this Epstein billionaire class, they will be held to account in such a system. And this is one of the reasons it's an existential fight for them to maintain the global imperial system, because the alternative systems that are being offered are not going to put up with their impunity, with their horror show, right? Like people like Bill Gates, activists in India, leftists and imperialist anti-colonial scholars have been saying this guy has been trialing vaccines on, young girls in India, in Africa, leading to infertility, death, all these things, and they're projected as humanitarians, and their, mask further fell down for the rest of the world when they came out in the Epstein files. But what they enjoy under the system is this a glorification, a celebration of their success within a hugely exploitative system on the backs of, the free exploitation of minerals and resources from the global south and near free exploitation of labor from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific. And, this kind of international legal system, international trade system represented by the World Trade Organization, which allows them to keep profiting from patents, from the monopolization of science and technology, which should be used for the benefit of humanity, which so many people across the world contribute to, but then gets captured by these corporations. So it's in their existential interest to maintain it, and therefore they're going to fight, and they're not a weak force. So when we think about it, after the World War II, we had these two poles. We had the Soviet Union, which rose within decades, right, through an alternative system, not relying on their capitalist class. They industrialized to a very comparable level within a few decades. And so the alternative system actually works. The alternative systems work. And it is in the interest of the global capitalist class, the elite in the West especially, to continue to maintain this narrative of Western exceptionalism, capitalist exceptionalism, and all that, and to ensure that China is never going to achieve, dominance. Even like when you think about it, New Zealand is trading a lot with China. You'd think that New Zealand's ruling class would have, somewhat a balanced view on China. But ultimately, when you look at it, New Zealand is New Zealand's billionaire class is ideologically opposed to to China, and therefore they will always support these kind of things like AUKUS and stuff like that, because that alternative system is not going to allow for the impunity and the free reign of this, horrific, it's revealed as a pedophile billionaire class, which sits above international law, which sits above our accountability mechanisms, which sits above, every single vestige of humanity that people across the world cherish. And for them, it's an existential fight to maintain this empire. So that's who we're up against. And, you've mentioned, all of us have mentioned the military, financial, but also their dominance in information and knowledge structures. And this is where I think the imperial core has an important role. The leftists in the imperial core has an important role to make sure that we are dismantling this information and knowledge infrastructure that they have built to justify and continue their reign over the world, right? Like I remember at the start of this back in January, when I was talking about the possibility or, the likelihood of United States and Israeli intervention in those riots which happened after the protests in Iran, people were saying, like the left in New Zealand, people who call themselves socialists were saying, Josephine, do you expect us to wave the flag of the Ayatollah? Like as if the Ayatollah is something that is so contemptuous. They would never speak in that sense of, Western leadership structures or anything, but they've got this very unique contempt for, alternative systems, the systems in the global south, which now have proven, which is why it's important to notice that United States has been defeated in the war against Iran, that they have actually a superior system to the United States in so many ways. But back then they were laughing at me. How dare you, have a position that is not completely disdainful of the Ayatollahs? And now they're pretending as if they never said that. And, they're saying suddenly after the assassination of the Ayatollah, they saw that the Ayatollah is a leader of millions of people in the global south, right? Like millions of Shia people, Muslims, but also as a revolutionary. Ayatollah Khamenei was a revolutionary who was respected across the global south, and now they're seeing that. So what is the role of the global left? The left in the imperial core is to start applying a critical lens to the empire's information infrastructure and knowledge narratives that they have carefully constructed over the last 500 years of colonization.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to go back a little bit to something you said that relates really strongly to this control of information. You mentioned like Bill Gates and his biopiracy stuff. And of course, every time a new technology comes along that offers control over people, again, it goes back to this taking people's autonomy. These people are jumping on it. We have this proliferation of data centers around the world for data mining as well as AI, both of which offer to cut messy human beings out of the loops of power, and everything we're seeing out of what they call AI so far shows that as you scale it, it becomes less efficient, and it's really good at doing some things, but as a whole, it's just going to burn through lots of resources and be essentially an economic impediment, but it will lessen the power of labor. So what I'd like to say is that we talk about the military-industrial complex, and I tend to refer to the empire complex, and that includes all of these things that give these levers of power, and no one's come along all the time. But obviously, oil has become central. It became central in the early 20th century. And it became a tool because it's so necessary for military power and industrialization, and for the Green Revolution, so food as well. It became the tool by which they gained control of the finances of the world, and finance is also essential. And a lot of this, you can actually see it in John Hobson's imperialism. He's sort of describing the way the British imperial state worked. And there isn't a divide in this, but they blurred the line between government and the private sector to the point where you are basically looking at I don't know whether you'd call it feudal or what, but you are basically, the levers of power are not necessarily where people think they are. They are, and there are these things like the Bank of England, say, or which has had a lot of interpenetration with British intelligence and so forth. And
You mean we can't just vote them out, Kieran?
Sorry?
We can't just
You
vote them
can't
out?
you vote the Bank of England. Well, and the oil industry and its interpenetration with naval intelligence going back even that far. And of course, this has continued as a trend to this day. So the state and these aspects of the private sector, the supposed private sector, are actually all part of the same empire complex. And so they also like to control pharmaceuticals, food production, water, all the critical infrastructure that they can get their grubby little mitts on. And the more technological, the more exclusive it is, the better for them.
Yeah, and I just aware that we're coming up to time. But something we haven't talked about is the degradation of health systems, but also healthcare structures coming directly out of the US under RFK Jr. to bring back pandemics, essentially, which have for centuries been a tool of empire. And I think looking at it as the empire complex is a pretty useful way to think about it in an all-encompassing way that we can then look at different parts of different levers within. Because otherwise you just so quickly get overwhelmed with like, what about this other thing they're doing? What about this other thing they're doing? Are these all distinct and separate? Are these all new things? No, they're not. They're part of the same thing. They're different tools for doing it. And yeah, AI seems to be the latest version of that until and if that bubble collapses, which is looking pretty significant. But that bubble collapsing is going to be a way to collapse economies, and then they'll use that as a crisis to take advantage of. So even then, that speaks to this idea that things might decline. They might have stuff that fails, but what is the outcome after that? What happens within in response to that allows them to consolidate power, or what happens in the decade following that? What new technologies appear that fill that gap? What is this tool being used for? And in the case of AI, it seems predominantly used as a way to control labor, as a way to give a justification for cutting jobs, as a way to use huge amount of energy and drive up energy costs, to use up a huge amount of infrastructure budget under an imperative to build these things that everyone knows aren't doing what they say that they do. More than anything else, it is to make life worse for the rest of us, put us in a more desperate situation, give us less resources, and make it harder for us to organize. Because, and I think, Josephine, you hit on it perfectly, for the people at the top, for the people making these decisions and the people making the decisions on their behalf, this is existential. I think they are afraid. And as Kieran said, they're also lunatics. And they also don't know what they're doing. And so the first thing that they think of is, how can we fuck everyone else up? How can we do things that are horrific? How can we put people in a position where they have to rely on us at worst, and at best they have to get on board with us, because otherwise they will cease to exist. And maybe some of us will as well, but we're going to come out on top and fuck the rest of you.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just looking at these mass layoffs that are happening in tech corporations, giants like Meta, Amazon, Oracle. Thousands of people being laid off under the name of AI. So yes, the conditions are going to get worse. But the solution is the next question, I think. What should be the solution? Because what I see from a lot of the people in the Western left is kind of a return to social democracy, the post-war consensus, which the working class in the West kind of, um, I think the whole Western system managed to crush the more radical elements on the working class left and incorporated this more moderate labor movement into, into the system, and a consensus which was achieved during the social democratic phase or the welfare state phase in the West, where, Western working class were provided certain improved rights and conditions, such as, universal health care and housing support and all those sorts of things, which have been right now, it's eroded and it's in its bare bones, and that's being eroded again. And the reason why, it didn't last is because social democracy is not really a solution to the problems that we're facing. And the solutions shouldn't be going back to social democracy because, within a few decades, right? So the first Labour government came to power in 1935. The welfare state started being, built around them. Around then, it was inspired by, for example, the Soviet model, central planning, government-funded infrastructure building, and all that. And it was good. It was good. It did create prosperity for so many working class communities in this country and across the West. But it didn't last long, right? Just a few decades later, the empire strikes back because, by the late 70s and early 80s, you see that, they're using these crises like the oil shocks back then. We're going through one right now as an excuse to, put in these neoliberal, going back to, what we had before social democracy, which was laissez-faire free market capitalism, where workers had no rights and it was just freedom for the people at the top, and just, mythology of free market capitalism, which is rooted in this idea of individual freedom, but freedom only exists for the people who have economic, the privilege and prosperity. For the rest of the people, they are reliant on the people who own all the resources, all the land, all the businesses, all the assets for their day-to-day livelihood. It's not freedom. It's like Lenin said, it's freedom and democracy for the people at the top. So the solutions we need to be very careful not to make the same mistake. It's not about, just taxing the rich. We need to make it normal to say that we put a ceiling on what people on what people can own, and we have to confiscate the wealth off of the people who are owning so much. Right now in New Zealand, the top 10% own 70% of the wealth, right? So it's not a radical ask to confiscate the wealth. This country was built on confiscation of wealth from
We're good
so
at it.
yeah, so I don't think it needs to be considered a radical ask when, mothers, when children, 1 in 7 children in this country are living in material hardship. So the solution isn't taxing the rich, because the rich will remain powerful. They'll remain powerful through imperialism in the global south, and they will remain powerful through separating the working class struggles in the West by giving the Western working class some concessions and extracting from the global south, so they, separate the struggles. We can't allow that to happen again. It needs to be the overthrow of that billionaire pedophile class.
Yeah, I feel like democracy is a set of muscles that have atrophied, and we need to start exercising them. But as we do, we build them up. I think the thing is that if we lived in a just world where things happen because they should, if Western liberal ideals actually existed, then we would be able to say, oh, this is wrong. And then the people in power would go, oh, yes, you're right. This is wrong. We have to change this, But we're seeing that they can get away with more and more and more. But the answer is not to give up on everything. The answer is that we have to just fight harder. We need to do things. We need 100 times as many people as it should take, doing 100 times as much work for 100 times as long in order for them to live up to, even the remotest bit of democracy they claim to have in these countries. But that means we work and work with things like pushing those leaders into a corner, making sure we try and try and make it hard for the journalists to keep lying. We make it, we work through local councils. We do whatever we can. We get out in the streets, we can. Everything, every little bit counts. And the longer we wait, the harder it's going to be. We've already let it get pretty ridiculous. And a lot of the things we're talking about neoliberalism a lot here. And to me, neoliberalism and fascism are two peas in a pod. They become interchangeable at some point. But they both claim certain things in certain ways, and they are melded together in a lot of ways. And I was referencing a book by Clara Mattei, The Capital Order: How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism. And of course, she's talking about post-World War One, so it's not neoliberalism as such, but of course, in fact, it was supported by John Maynard Keynes at that stage. Ironically, he would later change his mind, but it became the way that neoliberals looked at the world after World War Two. And, we've seen this interbreeding between neoliberalism and fascism all the way along, such as, Milton Friedman's support of Pinochet and so forth. It's always had this jackbooted side to it. And I have actually forgotten where I was going with that, but do read that book. And another book recommendation I'd have is The War Against All Puerto Ricans, which is about the genocidal nature of the US occupation of Puerto Rico. And it is incredibly eye-opening because this is something they don't talk about. And you can see the reality of imperialism written, because there are no excuses. There is no the tyrant there did this. This is them doing what they do in its purest form, and you can see that it's not about fighting the Soviet Union or anything like that. It's not because the Israel lobby made them do it. None of that is there at all. This is what they do. So I do recommend that. It's a bit of a grueling read, but yeah. So I'll just leave it there, I suppose, and trail off as Kyle has done in the past.
Thanks, Kieran. Josephine, any final points that you wanted to make just before we
Yeah.
wrap this up?
Yes, absolutely. I just want to say there is no social justice without economic justice, which means what is economic justice? We have this class which has concentrated the wealth of the entire planet and made themselves above any systems of accountability. It's, far from being democratic, anti-democratic class, right? That we just can't capture or under any of the frameworks that we have right now. So in order to make them accountable, we need to have economic justice, right? So what does that mean? I want to now, take that concept into the political sphere. And I would say that we can't really have political democracy without economic democracy. So we need to talk about that more, democratic economy, having a democratic economy, because at the moment, the land, the resources, the labor of our nations here in Aotearoa, they're not democratically governed. There's no accountability on the way that the assets and the wealth of this country, which forms the basis of human life, right? The sustenance and reproduction of human life is not up for debate. And when that's the case, that human dignity requires having economic sovereignty, we should bring the concept of economic sovereignty, economic democracy, economic justice back into the conversation here, but also that's the same conversation we have to have at a global level. Because we've had many conversations on 1 of 200 about this war in Iran being fundamentally rooted in an opposition of the global imperial system to sovereignty, to the fact that people can use the resources in their region for the benefit of themselves rather than expropriating it for the profits of the Epstein billionaire class. So this is the conversation that we need to bring back when we talk about even Tino Ranga Tiratanga, democracy, elections here. The elections are coming up. We need to bring this discussion of economic justice back into the forefront of our political discussions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, both of you. And thank you to our audience for listening in. I hope you've learned some ways to help us deconstruct the information structures in the Imperial core, because I think that's absolutely correct. There are a wide range of ways we talk about these things that preclude us from actually making a change. There are ways that we think about things that preclude us from making a change. It's always, oh, what little thing can we ask of the mega rich, right? What little thing can we ask of our politicians? And it takes the opportunity away. But as this is a crisis being created by the billionaire class to make our lives worse, it's also a crisis we can take advantage of as well. And I'd really love to see more ostensibly left-wing political parties, left-wing organizations being more aware of that and understanding that they can actually offer and ask for more, as opposed to just trying to tinker around the edges, say, oh, maybe we'll give you some free dental care. It needs to go far beyond that. And the electorate, the people of these countries are hungry for it. They know that something is wrong. They don't know necessarily what it is. They know that there's a material element to it and that their lives are fucking hard now. They don't know how to solve it, and you can give them solutions for that. And we're starting to see people across the West who I wouldn't say are going far enough, but are going further than we've seen in a long time. We've talked about Mamdani and Polanski in the US and in the UK, respectively, who I don't think are revolutionaries, but they're going much, much further than many others have gone in the West, and especially have gone here in New Zealand, and are reaping the benefits of that. And there's an opportunity to do that here as well. If you've found something useful here, like, share, and subscribe, as they say. Let people know there are alternative voices out there that are talking about this stuff and are trying to deconstruct it, trying to find ways to make these things work and try to change things, because I think it's a little bit few and far between at the moment. That's been another episode of 1 of 200. Thank you again to my co-host. Thank you again to you, the listeners. We'll catch you next time.
Akiteano.
If artificers are then I'm living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The words upon now is paid with good intentions. And I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they quote this as a cost we ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day in this vindictive, forgetful fucking rain.